All right, so today what I want to do is look at these models, and in doing so, I want to review the endocrine system. And the endocrine system is a collection of glands that are scattered throughout the body. And one of the reasons it's kind of a difficult system is because they're all doing different stuff, you know, and they're all regulated a little bit differently. So let's just look at this torso model here. And what endocrine gland do you see up here in the neck region?
Thyroid.
See the thyroid gland. That's the thyroid gland right there. Here's the larynx, and you can palpate the larynx. And so right below the larynx, wrapped around the trachea, is the thyroid gland. And just in general, what is the thyroid gland involved in? What is, what kind of stuff is the thyroid gland going to be involved in?
T4 production.
Stimulating cellular respiration.
Yeah, maybe I'll take a step back here. What hormones are released from the thyroid gland? Thyroid hormone. And there's two different forms. There's T4 and there's T3. Which one, about, over 90% of the thyroid hormone released from the thyroid gland is one type? What type, T4 or T3, is released from the thyroid gland?
T4.
It's T4, which is also called thyroxine or tetraiodothyronine. Good. And so T4 is released into the blood, and something that you'll notice here is there's a lot of blood vessels around the thyroid gland. And that's because the thyroid gland is constantly pumping out thyroid hormone. It needs a good blood supply to be able to ship that stuff out. So you have this production of T4 into the blood, thyroid hormone into the blood. What happens to thyroid hormone next?
Converts to T3.
Where does that happen?
Within the cells.
So what T4 does is it acts on its target cells. And does thyroid hormone have a lot of target cells in the body? Would you say that most, some, or very few cells of the body are target cells for thyroid hormone? Most. Okay, most, if not all, cells are targets for thyroid hormone. So thyroid hormone is going to travel through the blood. T4 is going to travel through the blood. It's going to actually diffuse into through the plasma membrane of the target cells. And what happens after T4 goes inside of its target cells? It gets converted to T3, which is also known as triiodothyronine. It goes from having 4 iodine molecules to 3 iodine molecules. What happens to T3 next? What do all hormones have to do to act on a target cell?
Form cellular respiration.
What do all hormones have to do to act on a target cell? What makes a target cell for a hormone?
To bind to its receptor.
It has to bind to its receptor. And so T4 gets converted to T3, and T3 binds to its receptor within the cell. And in this case, the receptor acts on the genome, it acts on the DNA, and it causes the expression of a protein. Okay? But what does that protein ultimately do? What's the effect on the cell? What is T4 gets converted to T3, it binds to its receptor, it works through the genome. What is the ultimate effect that this is going to have on the cell? What is the effect of T3 on a cell? What does it do?
To create ATP, cellular respiration.
It stimulates cellular respiration. Good. It stimulates that whole metabolic process of taking glucose and converting it to ATP. ATP is the chemical form of energy that we can use. Good. And it does that in most cells of the body because, cells need ATP to be able to work, to do their thing. Where does stimulation for thyroid hormone release, where does that come from? Does it act on its own? Or where is the stimulation for thyroid hormone release? Where's that coming from? It's coming from the brain. Yeah, so we have to look here at the brain. And the thyroid gland, like a few other endocrine glands in the body, are part of a larger, what we call endocrine axis, that not only involve the downstream endocrine organ, but they involve some structures up here in the brain. And where do these axes up here in the brain, where do they start? They start in the hypothalamus, this region right here. And in the case of the thyroid axis, does anybody know the hormone that the hypothalamus is going to release to stimulate this thyroid axis? You can know it by its initials are fine. TRH. TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone. So TRH is released from the hypothalamus. It goes into this capillary network, this portal system that we call the hypophyseal portal system. So it goes into the blood and it doesn't travel very far. It travels down to this little structure right here, which is just sitting in the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. What is this glandular structure right there that these hormones are going to act on? That's the pituitary gland. And there's an anterior portion and a posterior portion. Which part is this hormone going to work on? The anterior pituitary. Good. So TRH is released from the hypothalamus. It travels through this portal system, acts on the anterior pituitary. What does the anterior pituitary release in response to that? TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. What does that thyroid stimulating hormone do? It gets released into the blood and it acts on the thyroid gland and stimulates the release of thyroid hormone. And it's important to note that, for thyroid stimulating hormone to act on the thyroid gland, it has to bind to TSH receptors on the thyroid gland. So TSH binds to its receptors on the thyroid gland. That stimulates the release of thyroid hormone into the blood. Now, we want to maintain the limits of thyroid hormone within tight limits. Okay, it's a variable we maintain homeostasis over. And rather than staying constant throughout the day, levels of thyroid hormone are going to go up and down. They're going to oscillate up and down within this range throughout the day. Okay. And how does that happen? Well, it happens because of a feedback mechanism. And let's say that TSH release is high, so therefore the release of thyroid hormone level is high. So we have high levels of thyroid hormone. It's up here towards the upper range of where we want it to be. And at this point, we want it to come back down. Well, how's that going to happen? We have high levels of thyroid hormone. We want it to come back down. How is this system going to regulate that? How is it going to do that? What are these high levels of thyroid hormone going to do?
Feedback.
They're going to feed back to the hypothalamus and the pituitary. And what are they going to do when they act on those parts of the axis on the brain? They're going to inhibit it. They're going to inhibit the production of TRH, inhibit the production of TSH. And if you have low levels of TSH, that means you're decreasing the stimulation of the thyroid gland, which means you're dropping the levels of thyroid hormone release. So it brings it back down. And then when the levels get low, what do we call that mechanism whereby levels of thyroid hormone act back and inhibit this endocrine axis. What type of feedback is that? That's negative feedback. And then when levels get low, that negative feedback is going to go away, so TSH levels go back up, and that increased levels of thyroid hormone, it just oscillates up and down throughout the day. Good. Now, we looked at a case study on Graves' disease. And Graves' disease is directly related to this thyroid axis. What type of disease is Graves' disease?
Autoimmune.
It's an autoimmune disease. Good. And what are thyroid hormone levels like in somebody with Graves' disease?
High.
They're high. We have hyperthyroidism. We have high levels of thyroid hormone circulating around in the blood. And what are some symptoms, not just with Graves' disease, but with any type of hyperthyroidism? What are some symptoms that somebody might exhibit?
Weight loss.
Weight loss. Why would you exhibit weight loss?
Because it's extra stimulus for cells to create ATP.
Absolutely. You're stimulating cellular respiration. You're stimulating the breakdown of glucose into ATP, so you're going to have weight loss. What else?
Fatigue.
Fatigue would probably be hypothyroidism. Mm-hmm. Our problem here is that we're producing too much energy.
Excessive hunger.
You're hungry because you're burning through those energy reserves. Absolutely. What about your body temperature? It's going to be high because you may be sweating a lot because heat is a byproduct of cellular respiration, so you're producing too much heat. And another thing that happens with Graves' disease is it acts on the receptors of the eye, and it can stimulate bulging of the eyes, what we call exophthalmos. So bulging of the eyes is a symptom of Graves' disease. Now, in the case study, they did some blood work on both Carrie and her 3-month-old infant, who also had, all of these symptoms. And the levels, not surprisingly, the levels of thyroid hormone were really high. But her levels of TSH were low. And that's paradoxical, right? Because if you have low levels of TSH, that would mean that you have low stimulation of the thyroid gland and you'd have low levels of thyroid hormone. But what that implies with the disease is that the thyroid gland is getting stimulated independent of TSH. So the thyroid gland is releasing this thyroid hormone independent of TSH. And can anybody pinpoint what's going on with this autoimmune disease? Why the thyroid gland is being stimulated related to this autoimmune disease? And with autoimmune disease, what happens is you have antibodies that you're producing that are attacking some part of the body that they normally shouldn't attack. They're not able to recognize those cells as their own. So does anybody know the specific part of the thyroid gland that these antibodies are attacking?
The receptors.
Good. They're attacking the thyroid stimulating hormone receptors that are located on the thyroid gland. They're binding to those TSH receptors, and by binding to the receptors, they're basically mimicking what thyroid stimulating hormone is doing. They're stimulating those receptors by doing that. And so that's causing the elevated production of thyroid hormone. Now, why are the TSH levels low?
Because T4 is sending the negative feedback.
Excellent. That's exactly it. Those high levels of T4 are feeding back on the hypothalamus and pituitary and causing low levels of TSH. Good. Did anybody catch what an appropriate therapy or what are some treatment options for for this for Graves' disease? Well, one is they could do a surgical removal of part of the thyroid gland, but why is that risky?
Because the parathyroid's behind it.
Because the parathyroid glands, there's 4 of them, 4 nodules. They're on the back of the thyroid gland, and you can take those out. What are the parathyroid glands involved in regulating?
Regulates calcium.
Blood calcium levels, and so it may disrupt that whole process. So what are some, did anybody catch what maybe a realistic treatment might be?
Isn't there a
Iodine.
Yeah, it was a radioactive isotope that I believe was radioactive iodine. Iodine is required for thyroid hormone production, and it accumulates in the thyroid gland, and if you attach a radioisotope to it, it can destroy part of the thyroid gland, which is part of the treatment here. Good. Now, just to kind of finish up on this case study, the mother's 3-year-old infant also had some of these symptoms, and it is possible that that the infant does have Graves' disease as well, and it's a heritable thing, and that the baby is responding, has this autoimmune disease going on with it as well. But what are some other possible options for why this 3-month-old infant is essentially exhibiting Graves' disease? Let's say it's not a genetic component. It's not something that's going on in the infant itself. Where could these autoimmune antibodies be coming from? How could they be getting into the infant's body to stimulate the infant's thyroid gland?
like breast milk?
From breast milk, or maybe through the placenta or something like that. Those antibodies from the mother could be getting into the infant's bloodstream, stimulating those receptors and causing elevated levels of thyroid hormone as well. Good. Okay, moving on. A couple other important endocrine organs, endocrine glands we want to look at are these guys right here, which are located on top of these guys. What are these organs right there?
Kidneys.
Those are the kidneys. So what are these endocrine organs that we find on top of the kidneys?
Adrenal glands.
Those are the adrenal glands. They're also called the suprarenal glands. Supra meaning above, renal meaning kidneys. So they're on top of the kidneys. And these are located in a retroperitoneal position. They're behind the peritoneal cavity. Good. And there's 2 major portions of the adrenal gland. There's an outer layer called the adrenal cortex. Cortex just means outer layer. It means bark layer, and you'll see that many places in the body. You have the renal cortex, which is the outer layer of the kidney. You have the cerebral cortex, the outer layer of the brain. So you see the term cortex quite a bit. It just means outer layer. So you have the adrenal cortex. Then you have the middle, which is called the adrenal medulla. Medulla meaning middle. And we're going to look at these independently. Let's start with the adrenal medulla. What are the hormones that are going to be released by the adrenal medulla? Epinephrine and norepinephrine. And it's a little, I wouldn't say confusing, but it's a little interesting because norepinephrine and epinephrine, those are neurotransmitters, right?
Yes.
Those are molecules that are released by neurons onto other neurons in some cases. But since they're being released into the blood, we consider them hormones in this case. Okay. What is going to stimulate the adrenal medulla to release epinephrine and norepinephrine into the blood?
Sympathetic nervous system.
The sympathetic nervous system is going to. Sympathetic neurons coming from the thoracic and lumbar region of the spinal cord are going to act on the adrenal medulla and cause the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine into the blood. What are some situations where this stimulation would occur? What do we refer to as the sympathetic system as? Fight or flight. So anything that raises your anxiety level, exercise, stress, anything like that's going to stimulate the sympathetic system and release epinephrine and norepinephrine into the blood. Now, what are some things that the sympathetic system does to the body? What happens to what does the sympathetic system do to the heart?
Increases heart rate.
Increases heart rate and also increases the contractility, how forcefully it beats. What does it do to the airways in the lungs? Do the airways constrict or do they dilate?
Dilation.
They dilate. We have bronchodilation, so you can get more gas exchange. You know, all these things that we want during exercise or fright. What does the sympathetic system do to the liver?
Releases glucose.
It does, during a period of stress or exercise, we want to maintain our blood sugar, right? So it acts on the liver and causes the breakdown of that glycogen into individual glucose units and ships them into the blood. So it's a mechanism to increase our blood sugar. And essentially, the epinephrine and norepinephrine that's now circulating in the blood because of the adrenal medulla, they're going to have, similar effects to that. They're going to work on different areas of the body and have those sympathetic effects on different areas of the body. And this is also the part of the adrenal gland that's involved in what we call the short-term stress response. Okay, stress that occurs hours to maybe, up to 1 or 3 days or something like that is the short-term stress response. The adrenal medulla and the sympathetic system are part of that. Then we have the adrenal cortex. And what are some of the main, I'm thinking of two, what are the two main hormones that are produced by the adrenal cortex? Aldosterone and cortisol. What classification of hormones are aldosterone and cortisol? They're steroid hormones. There's only a couple places in the body where steroid hormones are produced. One is the adrenal cortex. The other are the gonads, the ovaries and the testes. Good. With regards to aldosterone, we're going to come back to aldosterone when we talk about blood pressure and the kidneys. But when aldosterone is released, it's going to go in the blood, it's going to act back on the kidneys, and it's actually going to cause the kidneys to take sodium that would normally go in the urine, and it's going to pull it back into the blood. And when let me backtrack, aldosterone is released during a period of low blood pressure. And it's the job of aldosterone to increase blood pressure. So the way it does that is acts on the kidneys, causes sodium to move into the blood. And how does that help raise blood pressure? What happens when sodium moves into the blood? Water follows it. So that increases blood volume and that increases blood pressure. Good. So aldosterone is released during states of low blood pressure. What about cortisol? Cortisol is a steroid hormone. What type of physical states do you kind of associate cortisol with? That's kind of, I don't know if I directed you enough, but cortisol is a stress hormone. And the adrenal medulla is involved in short-term stress, but when we get into that long-term stress, that's when the adrenal cortex kicks in. And one of the things it does, and that's not necessarily a good thing, the body's trying to help. It's trying to help the body, but it's not necessarily good for the body. Aldosterone is released, and that increases your blood pressure. So you have chronically high blood pressure if you have chronically high stress. What's the job of cortisol in the stress response? raise blood sugar. The problem, though, is that the glycogen in the liver, most of that or if all of that was used up during the short-term stress response. So where are we going to get sugar from to put into the blood?
The fats and the proteins.
That's when we start breaking down alternative energy sources like fats. We can convert that to sugar, which is a good thing. But next we get into the proteins of the body, the skeletal muscles and stuff like that. And proteins aren't something that you want to be breaking down because they have their own jobs in the body. Another thing about cortisol that's interesting is it's a powerful immunosuppressant. It suppresses the immune system. And so with long-term stress, your immune system is stressed as well. And there's a whole branch of pharmacology based off of cortisol and cortisol derivatives that are involved in reducing inflammation, suppressing the immune system. Yep. Now, like the thyroid gland, the adrenal cortex is part of an endocrine axis. And so it's controlled by the brain, and it's the same deal. You have the hypothalamus, which is going to release a hormone that acts on the anterior pituitary, which releases a hormone into the blood. And that hormone acts on the adrenal cortex and stimulates the release of cortisol and aldosterone. And maybe you guys can pluck these out of your memory somewhere, but does anybody know what the hormone is that's released by the hypothalamus that's going to stimulate this whole adrenal axis? Do you know the initials for that at least? It's CRF or CRH, I'm not sure. Corticotropin releasing factor or corticotropin releasing hormone. One of those two, I can't remember. But we'll say CRH. CRH is released by the hypothalamus. It travels through the portal system, acts on the anterior pituitary. And this is a little more important. What's the hormone released by the anterior pituitary that's going to act on the adrenal cortex and stimulate the release of those steroid hormones?
Thyroid hormone.
ACTH. Adrenocorticotropin
Stimulating
hormone, yeah. So CRH, ACTH acts on the adrenal cortex and causes the release of cortisol and aldosterone. Yep, and that's the diagram right there. That you're...
Yeah. Oh.
All right, let's move on. And we're down here in the abdominal cavity. And I know we haven't covered this information quite yet, but I do want to talk about a little about this endocrine gland right there. What is this endocrine gland that we're looking at right there?
pancreas.
That's the pancreas. And the pancreas, it's difficult to see this. The stomach would be right on top of it. And so it's posterior to the stomach. And the head of the pancreas actually sits in the C of the duodenum. And then the body goes across and to the left side. And here's the tail of the pancreas that sits right next to the spleen. Okay. So we've talked about the pancreas before with the digestive system. The pancreas is part of two organ systems. One is the digestive system. And as you guys know, the digestive role of the pancreas is to produce pancreatic juice, which contains all sorts of digestive enzymes. It secretes those into the pancreatic duct, and then those digestive secretions get secreted into the duodenum, good, which is the mixing bowl. So those mixes with chyme coming from the stomach and whatnot. And that's considered an exocrine function. because you're releasing products into an open space, onto a body surface or an open space, but it also has an endocrine function. Endocrine refers to releasing products into closed spaces like the fluids into the blood or into the interstitial fluid of the body. What variable is the pancreas going to regulate? What variable is the pancreas going to maintain homeostasis over?
Blood sugar.
Blood sugar. Good. And what happens when blood sugar, well, I'll say this, when blood sugar gets too high, we call that hyperglycemia. Okay, good, you know that. When blood sugar gets too high, that has to be, first of all, that has to be detected by the body, and the pancreas actually detects that. Okay, so it detects those high blood sugar levels, and in response, it releases a specific hormone into the blood. What's that hormone that's going to be released into the blood that's going to drop those blood sugar levels? Insulin. Good. And so insulin is released into the blood. Just like thyroid hormone, most cells of the body have receptors for insulin. So insulin is going to act on most cells of the body. So insulin acts on those cells, and it stimulates those cells to take glucose from the blood and take it into the cell. Then thyroid hormone acts on that same cell and stimulates cellular respiration to break that into ATP. So they're both part of that process. And what about when blood sugar levels are too low and we want to get them back up? It releases glucagon. And glucagon, one of the main things it's going to do is act on the liver. And, you know, when times are good with regards to glucose, blood sugar levels, you know, the body doesn't want to just waste all that sugar, so it stores it. And one of the main storage areas for glucose is in the liver. And it takes those individual glucose units and it strings it together into these polymers. What do we call those polymers of glucose? How does the liver store glucose? What's that larger polymer molecule called? Glycogen. Glycogen. So when your blood sugar levels are high, after a meal, for instance, the liver takes that glucose and it pieces it together as glycogen. And then guess what? When blood sugar levels are low, glycogen or glucagon, a lot of these are similar, you know, they sound the same, which makes it confusing. Glucagon acts on the liver, stimulates that glycogen to be broken down into individual glucose units. Then it ships that glucose out into the blood. Good. All right. Okay, and then lastly, I want to get the reproductive systems involved. And this diagram may be a little hard to distinguish on the video, but this is a mid-sagittal cut of the female pelvis. This is anterior, this is posterior, and the female reproductive tract is represented in this diagram. Okay. There's the uterus, cervix, vagina. But with regards to the endocrine system, what are the endocrine organs going to be that controls female reproduction? Those are going to be the ovaries. And the ovaries are going to produce sex steroids. What's the main sex steroid that's going to be produced by the ovary? Estrogen. Okay, and it can also produce progesterone as well. And essentially what that's going to do is it's going to regulate a couple different reproductive cycles. It's going to regulate what we call the ovarian cycle, the maturation of the egg within the ovary, and then also ovulation of that egg. And you're also going to have steroid hormones, namely progesterone, that are going to act on the uterus and prepare the uterus for implantation of an embryo. So it's going to be acting on this inner lining of the uterus to provide a nice receptive environment for a potential embryo. And that's called the menstrual cycle. So you have the menstrual cycle going on in the uterus and the ovarian cycle going on in the ovary. They're both controlled by ovarian hormones, estrogen and progesterone. Now, where does the control for these ovaries come from? Yeah, it's one of these larger endocrine axes that start up in the hypothalamus. Does anybody know the hormone released by we haven't covered this yet, but the hormone released by the hypothalamus that's going to start this whole thing? GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. That's going to act on the anterior pituitary and cause the release of FSH and LH, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. And then that acts on the ovary and stimulates the release of ovarian sex steroids. This is a mid-sagittal cut of the male pelvis, and here we have the male reproductive system. And what are the equivalent of the ovaries in the male reproductive system? What are the male gonads, the endocrine organs that are gonna produce sex steroids? The testes. And what's the main sex steroid that the testes are gonna produce? Testosterone. And testosterone is going to act back on the testes, and it's going to stimulate what we call spermatogenesis, the production of sperm. And again, this is part of a larger endocrine axis. And guess what? The hormones are the same in the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. So GnRH acts on the anterior pituitary, causes a release of FSH and LH, travel through the blood, act on the testes, and stimulate the production of testosterone, which stimulates spermatogenesis.